If you have an interest in horses and love learning more about horses, the horse industry, teaching, or even managing your own horse business, then you're in the right place. We would love you to join us on our mission, which is to improve the lives of horses around the world through the education of riders, handlers, and trainers. So get comfortable, listen in, and enjoy.
Our guest today on Horse Chats is Carol Layton. Now, Carol's going to talk to us about science-based and cost-effective solutions for horse health and horse care. But before I introduce you to Carol, I'd like to remind you that at International Horse College, we want to make sure that you're enrolling in the right course for you. So the right course for you takes into account your previous experience and qualifications within the horse industry, and will consider any RPL or recognition of prior learning. And also we consider your career goals, your current time and travel restrictions. So to talk to a careers advisor, simply book a time at internationalhorsecollege.com or call them on 07, that's within Australia, 3102 5498. And that number's also on the website, internationalhorsecollege.com, registered training organisation 31352. Now, Carol, I haven't introduced you yet, but Carol Layton from Balanced Equine, her passion's to give science-based feeding advice rather than misleading marketing and often repeated myths. So we talked a little bit about myths a little while ago, but we're talking more about myths, and I know there's quite a few. So horses, and feeding horses, they're hindgut fermenting trickle feeders. They're not ruminants and they're not people. So we're going to talk specifically about a range of feeds and also maybe about some minerals and vitamin supplements that she recommends. Welcome, Carol. Welcome to Horse Chats.
Oh, thank you. What a great opportunity. It's lovely to be here.
Look, lovely to have you too. Now, I didn't actually warn you. Normally I warn the guests that the first question I ask them is about their inspirational quote. And I know you put one down here, which I totally agree with, but can you remember what it was?
Never stop learning was effectively what that's about, because, and especially with horses, like it's just, I know over the years I have learned a lot. I know I have. But then I think of how much I haven't learned, and, the number of times where I've found there'll be someone who is a font of information, and you know that they've done a lot of research and they've really reasoned through things. And then all I want to do is plug my little USB that's at the end of my thumb into them and try and download all that knowledge so I can just do a bit of a shortcut. But yeah, like it's wonderful to be knowledgeable about horses, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely.
I mean, try to be on that path.
There is another part to that too. This is from Albert Einstein. So he, not only does he says we never stop learning, he also says once you stop learning, you start dying. And I know you think that's a tad dramatic, but I suppose literally, if you stop learning, the world's changing so quickly now.
Yeah.
That if you stop learning, you're not learning the latest developments. And we're learning, I'm sure you would have seen them in your time teaching about feed. I'm sure you would have seen some later studies and changes, and you've got to stay up to date all the time as well.
Yeah, like I can think of a classic example of that, and that would be when I was a kid and didn't know squat really about horses and feeds and all the rest of it, but, having fun nonetheless. I remember hearing things about white filler. Did you ever hear of that, Glenys? I mean, a lot of people don't. I ask around because I find it fascinating that there was even such a phrase, like where did I imagine that? But no, it was a real thing.
What was the phrase again, Carol?
White filler.
Is that like as in oaten chaff and wheaten chaff?
Yep. Oaten and wheaten chaff, like as if it was some pillow stuffer. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And the irony of it all is that, after the enormous amounts of research, because even though we need so much more research done in horses, like there's massive amount of research required, there's still been a significant amount of research done since I was a kid. And we know that there's no such thing as hay or grass or anything that's going to be called a filler. Like that's just crazy. It's almost like brainwashing, because how on earth did people get this idea when, the forage is like the most important source of nutrients, not just for like the simple supply of nutrients, but also the gut health, fertility, a whole range of things, and behaviour.
Yep, yep. And I know that you are an endurance rider, and we can talk about that in a little while, but I'd just like to know, and this is even before I introduce the subjects that you're doing at Equitana, from endurance riding, how does nutrition affect endurance horses? Where's the relationship there? How did you get interested in that?
Yeah, right. Well, I just find that my background is science-based. I was a science teacher and later a computing teacher. So I kind of have that mind. Like if I try things out, I say I'm going to do a little experiment here, as we all do, sample size of one, that kind of thing. But I like to be critical too of what I see and read and do. And in endurance, one of the things that I love about the sport is how we really are pushed to care for our horses. We really like to complete is to win. That's the motto of endurance. Like, sure, there's a first place, second place, blah, blah. But actually, most people that fussed about that, you're there to have a good time. But at the same time, you want your horses to do it as easily as possible. So to do that distance is, there's like at the end of it, the absolute apex of it all is to have a horse that doesn't look like he's even done 80 kilometres. And he's ready to do it again. Like he's got that shine in the eye and he's got that spring in the step. Now, that's the aim. That's what we want to achieve. So, people who do complete an endurance ride, if their horse isn't looking the greatest at the end of it, like that's a real push to go and work out what's going wrong. You might have got the buckle, but you know that this is not ideal at all. This is not a good, you're not. So there's that kind of pushing to do better by your horse, because it's a real partnership. And so when I was, this is many years ago, I was trying to figure out what to feed my Arabs because I'd got into the sport of endurance with my now husband. And I was just feeding what I saw most other people feeding. Isn't that always commonly the case, that you go and check out what everyone else is doing? And then you think, well, if they're doing it, it must be the right thing. So that's one of the first things I learned going down this path, that just because everyone else is doing it, it in fact can mean not the right thing to be doing. It's just that we're all being a bit sheep and copying. And I wanted to look much further into how to best care for my horse, not for him to be faster, nothing like that, not to win events or anything like that, just how can I make it so that he can complete these rides easier. And that was the main driving force. And of course, with all the different horse individuals, my horse, Squiggle in particular, was a very poor doer. Like he should have been an Anglo rather than a pure Arab. Very difficult to keep weight on, but he was so laid back. Like he was such a brilliant, he's still alive, but he's retired. Such a brilliant, brilliant horse. So he had challenges, and of course we're all trying to avoid ulcers, even though it's extremely difficult, and so forth. So I was really driven to learn more about equine nutrition, and I looked into what courses there were, and because of my science mind, I didn't want to do one that they just tell you what to feed. They tell you what to do, because I want to know why. I want the depth and I wanted the evidence. So I wanted there to be a scientific base to it, and also practice, like good clinical practice. And that's when I found a course online that was just starting at the time. Dr. Eleanor Kellen in America had created an online course, and I was part of the first enrollment.
Do you remember what year that was?
That was 2009. The beginning of 2009 was when I started. And the beautiful thing is it's still going. It's still going. But the most amazing, brilliant thing about this course, it goes for 10 weeks, but what's so brilliant about it is that you pay, like I think it cost me like $200, something like that, even with the American currency exchange rate. But when you complete the 10-week course, you can then enroll for free in every class after that. So I've been a perpetual student since then. What is it now? 2024. Wow. I had no idea, of course, when I enrolled that it was going to be such a life changer, because this was all about my horses, and it evolved from being a hobby that I really got into, and where people started asking me to help them. But by 2010, I then got asked by Dr. Kellen to be part of her staff, where I tutor the new students if they would like some help with it. And it's been brilliant, and I love to stay with it, because as the years go past, there is some refinement to what we know about feeding horses and so forth, and the new studies coming out. It's nice to be abreast of what's coming along, and also knowing when to, there's such a thing as cherry picking studies, where you find the study that meets your bias and then you ignore the others. And so, things like that. Dr. Kellen is actually, she's a vet, and she's actually been a breeder of standardbreds and race standardbreds. So it's more than her just being in an office or going out in the field occasionally. She's living that life, and she's extraordinarily well respected in the field of equine nutrition. And the course is international. So there are students from Europe, the UK, and many Australians enroll as well. So it's brilliant.
So if you were going to give just one piece of advice to someone, and someone listening may have been doing some endurance riding, and they're in a situation where they're just copying what everyone else is feeding, but they just think, I'm sure there's more to feeding and nutrition than this. What sort of advice would you give an endurance rider just to do with the types of feed and nutrition? What's important more for endurance riders than for anyone else as far as feed and nutrition goes?
My answer to this one is it's going to be no different to any other horse in any other classification. Feeding an endurance horse, feeding a dressage horse, feeding a eventing horse, feeding, the basics of feeding horses are exactly the same, whether they're in work, not in work, and different types of work. And I remember when I was learning all about this, feeding the athletic horse and all the rest of it, is that the basics are exactly the same. It's no different, because what we're feeding is the evolved digestive system of a horse. What you mentioned earlier about the hind end fermenting trickle feeder, they're all doing that. So we need to feed that, and then we can make adjustments otherwise in terms of how much work they're in, their metabolic rate and so forth. But the basics are actually the same for all horses. And we run into trouble with horses. We're kind of doing Band-Aid solutions when we don't follow that. And so I can happily answer that question, but I would definitely say this is not just for endurance horses. This would be your horse in the backyard. And so the reason I'm saying that is that the number one feed that we can feed horses, no matter what background, what they're doing, is that we need to feed them a high fibre intake. Because the amazing thing about the fibre is that in not just the hindgut, also in the stomach, which is interesting, is these microbes. And they have this symbiotic, very, very happy partnership relationship going on with horses. And those microbial populations use that fibre that the horse is eating. So that can be the grass, the hay, and the feeds that I do recommend that are high fibre. They are using that fibre, and in the fermentation of that fibre, they produce what's known as volatile fatty acids, and one of them in particular, acetate, generates energy. Now that's energy to move, energy to breathe, energy to do all those chemical processes, energy to gain weight. It's like this is the best thing for horses, and there are studies that show that the high fibre intakes lead to high fertility, higher immune system responses and so forth, and in fact behavioural physiology as well. Just, like people sometimes ask me, what's the best calming product? And I'll go through the checklist, like how much salt are you feeding, because sodium's so important, and then, are you feeding feeds that I would consider junk feed rather than the health food, which is your high fibre feeds? So, and it's not just energy that is being produced. There's also the best thing about feeding a lot of fibre is that it's a really important source of vitamins and protein. It's, but going back to that whole white filler thing, it's not just roughage. And then these microbes have a role to play with increasing the availability of the minerals. It's quite fascinating when you look further into it. And so the other thing is that when you feed a high fibre type feeds, it relaxes the stomach and helps control the acidity in the stomach. And then you get all these other benefits. So I can go through the whole list, and it's almost like you could write a book on just fibre, and I think people have. There's that constant flow of material along the intestinal tract, which stimulates the normal motility, those muscular movements to keep the food moving. And so when the vet's listening in with the stethoscope and listening for gut sounds, I mean, what the vet is listening to can be what you fed that horse 2-3 days ago. So what you're feeding in the approach to an event that you might have on the weekend, whatever it might be, what you're feeding up to that point is so important. And, of course, you shouldn't really change things when you go to the event. And then that gut fill weighs down the intestine and prevents the displacements and twists. And so another thing that you can say is, like, what's the best way to avoid colic? I mean, there's different types of colic, but one of them would be to have this constant access to a high fibre source of food. And then, we can go on and talk about fertility and behaviour and so forth. But there's a lot of reasons why we should be looking at a high fibre intake. I mean, I remember some years ago at Equitata, and I mean, this is a long time ago, I went to one of the feed company's stands, and it had all the bowls of the muesli feeds, molasses coated, all that. Not my favourite thing. And I got asked by the salesperson, what was I feeding my horse? So I first of all made it very clear that my horse was on lots of grass. We're not in a semi-arid part of the world. We're eastern seaboard and there's lots of grass. We don't have any issues with the lack of grass. And then I feed a high fibre feed, and I feed some oats because my horse is in work and he needs that to maintain his energy and so forth. And I mentioned, I think at the time I was feeding Speedy Beet, which is beet pulp, because it was the only high fibre feed that was available in Australia. And he turned to me and he said, "Oh, that's way too much fibre." And he was serious. And I like to think that, to be fair to the sales guy, they won't have done an equine nutrition study that, people like myself have done, but I thought, yeah, that represented a lot of the attitude at the time and still does in some circles. It's funny to me because there'll be companies that will make out that the forage is this, like, it doesn't really matter what the nutrient levels are of this forage because what you get from that feed bag is what really matters. But what you feed, like let's say if you feed even up to 1 kilogram out of a feed bag, a bagged feed, is just this fraction, really small, or it should be, small fraction of what in fact that forage, the grass or hay or combination is actually providing. And then making it out as if you don't feed that recommended amount on the bag, you're cheating your horse of like nutrients. But we've looked at the maths and there are situations where the more of that bag feed you feed, the more likely your horse will become, for example, protein deficient. Because the more of the bag feed, which is usually a much higher in energy, like a concentrated feed, much higher in energy means that there's less grass that horse is going to eat. So that means the less amount of grass that your horse is eating or whatever it might be, like the hay or whatever, that's nutrients that horse is missing out on. And the bag feed may not replace what was in the grass. So if I can use this example just to simplify it, just to make it really simple, if say 1 kilogram of that bag feed might, for example, represent 3 kilos of the grass in dry matter. And when you think about like the actual, so let's pick one nutrient, copper. It might be that the copper value per kilogram is higher than what it is per kilogram in the grass. But then if you compare the 3 times that amount versus what the 1 kilogram is going to get, there's plenty of examples of where it's not a win to be feeding that bag feed at the recommended rate. So, and it's crazy to suggest that if you feed half the amount, you're cheating your horse. Like you're not going to give your horse their daily requirement. The daily requirement is by far provided by that forage. And maybe there'll be the key things like copper and zinc that will need boosting, but essentially, in a lot of cases, unless you're feeding kilos and kilos and kilos of grain feeds, and therefore the horse may not be seeing a blade of grass and lucky to see much hay, then they're going to be missing out on everything, because at the end of the day, when it comes to a complete feed, that complete feed, the most complete feed you can think of is going to be green grass. Nothing can compete with that.
So just as far as complete feeds go, because there's a lot of branding, and I don't know if there's a complete feed for endurance horses, but, there's complete feeds for mares and foals, or for show horses, or for horses in light work, medium work, heavy work. There's lots of complete feeds around. If someone was feeding that, what sort of research should they do to make sure that they're doing the right thing by the horse?
First of all, we've got to be a little bit more critical minded. A complete feed is a marketing term. I've searched high and low for a definition of complete feed that everyone's happy with. If you ask a room full of people, as I have, what I've found is that you get a bunch of different definitions of what a complete feed is. But the one I think a lot of people think of is that it will have everything in that bag feed. It's complete, and it will be higher in amounts than compared to, because I've asked, what's not a complete feed? What do you call them? Incomplete feed? Like, what does it even mean? And what I've found is that people aren't too sure about it, but they've heard it said over and over and over and over, and they've just accepted it. Whereas to me, it's just illogical, because there is no bag feed that competes with completeness in terms of breadth, like range of nutrients, than green grass. Because bag feeds will generally be low or have zero omega-3 fatty acids, and grass is a really important source of fatty acids, particularly omega-3. And when we talk about omegas, we're talking about the ratio. That's what matters. And a lot of people get confused with this. It's not simply that we want to make sure that horses are getting sufficient omega-3s. We want to make sure that the ratio of omega-3 to omega-6 is similar to what they would get in grass, because that's their natural feed. And so when I say grass, I mean plant vegetation, essentially. It could be the reeds and sedges, it could be herbs, it can be the leaves off trees and so forth. And we'll just say grass because it makes it easier. But we're meaning plant vegetation. So we know that the omega-3 to omega-6 is, if we're not around and interfering and micromanaging and doing anything with horses and they're free to do what they like, they'll be getting a ratio around 4-to-1 omega-3 to omega-6. So what we're trying to do, and I should say it can be as high as a 20-to-1 omega-3 to omega-6. Now, pretty much all bag feeds, unless they've got some proprietary method of stabilising the omega-3s, 99.99% of feeds available on the market, if they've got any fat in the feed, any oil or fat, it's going to be omega-6, which is the one that is mostly associated with the inflammatory pathways of the immune system. And the omega-3s are mostly associated with the anti-inflammatory. You need both. And this is applying to all mammals, right? It's just the ratios change. But in horses, if we're looking at grass plant material, it's around, say, 4-to-1. So for a start, these complete feeds are not complete because they don't have that. And then we can have a look at things like vitamin E. Now, vitamin E is a really interesting nutrient. It's a fat-soluble vitamin E, and the problem with vitamin E is that it degrades. It acts as a preservative when it's with other nutrients, organic matter. So it really should be stored separately. When you're going to feed a vitamin E, you should actually put that in the feed bucket with the other feeds separate, as in you can mix it in and then feed it to your horse, but you wouldn't store it there. And Dr. Kellen teaches that whenever you look at any bagged feed, any vitamin mineral product, when you read the vitamin E amount, just halve it, immediately halve it. And I guess there's a good chance there won't even be that half amount there. And that's why, and you might have seen that a lot of people are keen when they feed vitamin E, they'll just get the vitamin E capsules from the chemist or online, because as long as the vitamin E capsule contains oil, because it needs oil right there when it's passing through the intestinal wall into the bloodstream, because it's a fat-soluble vitamin, it has to be right there. It can't just have fat somewhere hanging around nearby. It's got to be right with it. So if you feed a vitamin E powder, for example, it needs to be wet with oil, because studies have shown in people, which are mammals, but we can use this study because we don't have a horse study yet, but we can use what we know about in people in terms of the vitamin E transferring through the lipid wall of the intestine, is that the membrane. So we do know that fat needs to be right there. Otherwise, it gets excreted. So to maximise, because vitamin E is not a cheap nutrient, it's actually one of the more costlier ones, then that one ideally you'd be adding separately, and you wouldn't rely entirely on it being in that bagged feed. So that's another one that is a problem. So when green grass gets turned into hay, for instance, there's a loss of vitamin E and a loss of omega-3 fatty acids. And then if you have a look at what they call a complete feed, I've compared complete feeds that everyone has said, yes, the manufacturer said is complete, and then looked at what some people are saying are not complete. And I find that certain nutrient levels are actually higher in the not so complete feed. Like if you just compare, kilo to kilo. To me, I've not come across an argument yet that convinces me that it's anything but a marketing term. And so the other thing is, when you look at the recommended amounts on the bag, like I used to follow that. I was all for that. But then the more I learned about equine nutrition, the more I looked at it and went, this does not make sense to me at all, because let's say they recommend 1 kilogram, just picking a number, and that would be for, say, a 500 kilogram horse in moderate work. That makes sense. Sort of, that's how I haven't looked at these back of bag things about that in so many years. I don't bother, because it's pointless. It's just so irrelevant, because at the end of the day, the feed manufacturer doesn't know if your horse is in fact in semi-arid South Australia where you're desperately trying to get hay, or you're on my rich eastern seaboard grass that's pumping out and full of nutrient levels. Do you know what I mean? And a lot of energy. Like I've done those free diet things where I remember finding it hilarious, because even though I mentioned about my grass, this guy who was doing the free diet analysis was telling me I was meant to be feeding X kilos of this product and the significant quantity of this other product. I'm going, mate, there's just no way in a million years this is going to happen. It was so not realistic, but it would be realistic for a different horse with a different paddock situation, whether how difficult it is to get quality hay and all the rest of it. But still, one company paid me early on to do the back of the bag thing, and I did my best. I got the nutrient analysis done. I wrote the blurb about how brilliant the feed was. I only accepted to do this, by the way, because it was a high fibre feed. Wouldn't have done it otherwise. And then I had to come up with the amounts. And then later they increased them. It wasn't big enough for their liking. So, it's just one of these things that I totally get it, because I was there. I needed the feed bag instructions to give me a guidance. I needed that. But if you get further into it, you'll come to understand that the big thing in your horse's intake that matters the most by far is the nutrient profile of your grass, your forage, by far. And you can't guess it by looking. You can't look at a photo and a classification, C3 grass, blah, 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 and go, oh, that's the analysis, because you can go online to Dairy One, which is the massive or equianalytical in America. It's like the lab that seems to have the most samples sent to it. It's got hundreds of thousands of samples, and they put them all in a database. You can see the variation, the standard deviation, how much that varies. And you can look up, common grass types like oaten. You can look up lucerne, legume, and you have a look at the variation, and you then realise that when a company or a person presents a set of numbers as being an estimate or an average, you then realise how completely and utterly useless that estimate is. And if you're feeding only a kilo of something, then that estimate will do the job, because it's all the vast amount of the rest of the intake, which should be your forage. If you got an estimate for that, then you're kidding yourself. It's delusional to think that your estimate it might be right. You might get lucky, but chances are it'll be far from reality. But, we all are doing the best we can. So that's why if anyone listening to this thinks that they'd like to learn about equine nutrition, then I wholeheartedly recommend Dr. Kellen's course, NRC Plus, because you can get smart with it. But one of the things you'll learn is just how important for horses a high fibre intake is, and that cheating a horse of fibre means you'll probably start looking for a digestive product, or all the different products that are on the market that seem to be quite popular these days.
Carol, at Equitana, you're speaking on Saturday and Sunday, and if someone's thinking, well, I can only go to one, it conflicts with other things. The first one, you're talking about how to build a robust immune system and healthy gut. And then on the Sunday, you're talking about safe feeds for equine metabolic syndrome and Cushing's. If someone is deciding, should I go to this one or that one, can you give us an overview of each and the differences, if they're not quite sure which one?
Well, I think probably the Sunday talk will be of most relevance to people who are grappling with the challenge of managing a horse with insulin resistance or equine metabolic syndrome or Cushing's, PPID. And if your horse is diagnosed with Cushing's, then one of the common symptoms is actually laminitis, insulin resistance. So I'll be talking there about the different types of laminitis, and also if you read an article or you talk to people and they're talking about laminitis, how important it is to get that actually distinguished, what type of laminitis it is. Because not all horses with laminitis are insulin resistant equine metabolic syndrome. It actually, you've got mechanical laminitis for a start. You've got, there can be a whole range of reasons why a horse might be have the lamina separate. And not all horses with separated lamina have insulin resistance and so forth. But there's also the other one, which is your rich carbohydrate overload into the hindgut, which is what more traditionally they call founder. It's an acute catastrophic thing. So if you have someone who says that, these are the things you to avoid if your horse is laminitic, well, I guess I can't help it. I'll be saying, okay, which laminitis are we talking about? Because if your horse has got separation from, say, two long toes, the trimming cycle's not frequent enough, and because of those laminar forces, it's like peeling back and you've got the separation there, well, you don't need to worry about low sugar and starch intake, because you don't need to worry if your horse is not insulin resistant, which is all about the insulin going so high because the resistance to the insulin, and then that series of steps that leads to your horse being in pain and laminitic, and it's just horrendous. If you don't have an insulin resistant horse, you don't have to worry about the safe feeds I'm going to talk about. But I'll start off by talking about the types of causes of laminitis, because I've had over the years people who have been putting a lot of money, a lot of time, so much energy into managing, say, a horse. They had convinced themselves in their head that was insulin resistant. They hadn't had the vet do a blood test, so forth. They just see. And then in the end, I remember in one particular case that wasn't long ago, it was a period of wet weather where the hoof wall, the integrity wasn't brilliant to start with, and it was, the separation was actually from the, and they got their horse tested, of course, which is why we, let's settle it once and for all. And because I think the breed of horse at the time, it didn't lend itself to being insulin resistant, and it didn't have certain other factors which made more sense, but there was so much time and energy spent on keeping the horse off the plentiful grass this owner had, and the cost of hay and everything. Like, before you drive yourself into a early grave, let's really find out for sure, so that you've been the most wonderful horse owner, you're doing all this care, but there's a possibility that you don't need to do that, and that you need to be looking at, for example, the hoof care, like the quality of the hoof there, what's going on there, and perhaps trying to get the horse off where the wet areas are and onto gravel or something like that, managing it differently. And fortunately, in this case, my hunch proved correct. The horse wasn't insulin resistant at all. So I want to talk about the different types of laminitis so that people can get some information to be able to talk to their vet about. And then, should it be confirmed, then I can talk about what feeds are available in the Australia feed market that are considered a safe option. Because there's a lot of feeds marketed as safe for equine metabolic syndrome, and they're actually not according to the research, not the research we have, because it's more to it than just low sugar and starch. There's also needs to be low in fat and needs to be moderate in protein as well. So that's that one. And then the first one, looking at a robust immune system and digestive health. Well, you might have already thought that there's a good possibility I'll be talking about the importance of fibre, and I'll go into more detail about how beneficial a high fibre intake and how to feed a high fibre. It's really easy, because back then in the late 2000s, the only option we had was Speedy Beet, imported from the UK, which is the beet pulp. But now we have a whole range of feeds that are primarily soybean hulls or lupin hulls, and we're so lucky in Australia to have lupin hulls grown in Australia. There's areas like in Western Australia where they're growing lupins. And I can also explain why lupin hulls are not lupins, because it gets confusing, because there's certain feed companies that are pretty much have feeds that are primarily lupin hulls, but they're calling them lupins. And lupins are not lupin hulls, because the hulls are the seed coat without the actual internal lupin. Big difference. But anyway, the lupin hulls and soybean hulls and beet pulp are just brilliant, and we have so many choices now. It's just wonderful to see over this number of years that we've got so much more choice now.
Talking about lupin holes, I can remember, when I was quite young, going for a drive with my parents and my father looking over and looking at the Milo, and we're like, Milo? We were very excited, Milo. And he said, I'll just stop the car and go and grab you some off the footpath. So he went and, just grabbed a little bit, and we're like, Milo. It's just awful, it's just not, when you think the difference between sorghum and Milo, it's just completely different feed. It's just something that, and I think, is it a Queensland thing that we call it Milo instead of sorghum, or is it called Milo elsewhere?
Oh, I don't know. I just roll with it. I just go with the flow, because, for me, every hay is a grass hay. It's just, is it lucerne? Is it oaten? Is it Rhodes? Is it teff? Is it whatever it might be? And then people have a distinction between grass hay and meadow hay. There's this actual different definition, and I just go, because it depends on the area, people have their local language for feeds and so forth. I just try and go with the flow.
I've got a question about you being an endurance rider. So I know you're a long-distance endurance rider, with some success, I think a bit more than some, because your horse, Amani Mr. Squiggle, was an Australian points and distance horse for the One Horse, One Rider partnership. You've been successful in a few long-distance marathons, 160k rides, including Quilty. What is it that you love about endurance?
I think it's the partnership. It's just nice to be able to go riding in areas that you wouldn't get to normally. It's a real social thing too. There's lots of chatting that goes on when you're riding. You're managing your horse. I mean, I used to ride with others. I used to ride on my own, because there were times when I just wanted my horse to have the freedom to choose what pace he wanted to do and when he wanted to do it. The beautiful thing about endurance is that once you get this partnership, you get so, when they talk about how good it is when horse owners, they know their horse. Like no one knows your horse as well as you the owner, and the one you spend, like who spends all the time with your horse. And, I remember how, there's a lot of talk in the last few years about how important it is to synchronise your steps with your horse's walk and things like that. Like, a lot of it in endurance, you get off and you walk them down hills because you want to rest their back, and it actually gives them a real pep of energy when you get off. And it's really nice that I just remember when I was doing Shazada, which is a 400-kilometre marathon ride over 5 days at St Albans, how magical it was to feel so at home in the saddle on my horse. But at the same time, when I'd get off and walk beside him, we would just be synchronised, just be swinging along at the same rhythm. It was just heaven. And, when he says, I don't want to go slow anymore, I want to head on and I want to speed up, and you go, all right then, let's go. And, you're just part of that sort of thing. And then, you might get a little tired and I go, yeah, I can understand that. We just did one heck of a hill then. Let's have a rest, And it's so important too that you spend time letting your horse eat when they can along the way, because it's unfortunately ulcers are an ever-present issue for endurance horses. So trying to get as much grass along the way to fill the stomach and have, all of that. And notice I haven't even talked about the finishing. It's all about being out there and enjoying it. I've done a 160-kilometre quilty where I got to the 5th leg and I didn't want it to end. I mean, that's extreme. But I was having such a great time. I was riding with a wonderful friend and it was just heaven. So that's the, and the collegiality, the way everyone's so generous to help each other. And I love the fact that there's vets involved, like there are, like if you, when you trot your horse out, if there's a niggling issue there, I want to know. Like, I care. I want to know. And if it's possible that the vet can see something that I can't pick up because I'm not the vet, and the vet could say, look, I can see there might be an issue here, or it might be that your horse is getting a little sore in his back there, and it's not enough to vet you out, but, you should take care with that. You might want to work that and palpate it and just see if you can rearrange, maybe use a different saddle blanket to care for your horse. I think that's pretty, because it's challenging. Endurance is not easy. It's challenging. But I love the way it challenges you to become better at managing your horse. And, it's magical because of that. Lots of things I could share with that.
Are there any other questions that I should have asked you? Anything else that you'd like to finish off with, as we sort of come to an end? Anything that you'd just like to cover?
Well, maybe for horse owners that don't want to learn equine nutrition, who just want to be able to make some pretty straightforward decisions about feeding their horses, what would be the best advice there? First step is grass is king. Unless there's a special case here like insulin resistance or, whatever might be a veterinary diagnosed issue, grass is king. And I've had people contact me over the years who they've had heaps of grass, but they've got scared because of what they've read online and what they've been told, that it's evil. And so they're buying hay, and I'm going, you're mad. It's like, if your horse hasn't got these other issues that would make it impossible to put your horse on grass, get your horse out there on the grass. Like, don't hold back. This is the best thing. I know you're scared, but in the majority of cases, unless it's truly a toxic pasture from, say, toxic spray, like really horticultural type full-on sprays that might have created some toxic environment there. But anyway, that would be extremely rare. But what I'm getting at is that grass is king. Grass is king. And the more bag feed, the less grass. And you really want it the other way. You want to feed out of a bag of feed the smallest amount possible to act as a carrier for the key minerals that are going to be low in grass. And bag feeds aren't any better because, again, they don't know what the rest of the profile is, and they can't go overboard. But so copper and zinc primarily. So the smallest amount act as a carrier for your salt, because salt is so important. A lot of pasture, a lot of hay isn't high enough in sodium and sometimes chloride. Sodium is extremely important. Anyway, that's another talk. So the smallest amount possible be a carrier, and then in the thoughts that what your horse is consuming in terms of the grass, hay or a combination, and that smallest amount act as a carrier for the vitamin E, your salt and your minerals, maintain a good body condition score. Like I've had people say to me, my horse just stands at the gate for hours on end. He's got heaps of grass, but he won't go out there and eat it. And it's like, well, he's got you trained, he's looking for his dessert. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And then other than that, if the grass is not enough, if there's not sufficient amount of it, or it's not high enough in energy, like in the middle of winter, then you may have to, your next choice is hay. Okay, and hopefully, ideally not oaten, because that can be fairly ordinary, not white filler, but it can be a bit of an ordinary nutrient profile, depending on where you are in the country. But lucerne can be good for boosting that protein, because in winter the grass will be dormant in a lot of areas, and when it's dormant, it's not actively growing, that's when protein is at its lowest. So lucerne would be, with its high protein and quality high protein, it would be ideal, a small amount, maybe a kilo. And then the bag feed would be any feed that is predominantly, if not entirely, either beet pulp, soybean hulls, lupin hulls, or a combination. They're the main ones there. And if it's barley, which is the majority of the horse industry in Australia, then you're just feeding what I consider, and many nutritionists would consider, to be junk feed. But it depends on the workload of the horse. What I prefer to do is feed the high fibre feed. And then for my endurance horses, because they will hit the wall with fatigue on that, not all do, but mine will. I learnt that early on. I started feeding oats, even though I was scared. I was terrified. I thought I was going to turn my Arab into this crazy horse. And if I saw him in the paddock do the neck twist that Arabs like to do, I thought, oh no, it's the handful of oats I gave him. But in fact, if anything, he settled beautifully. His heart rates were, if anything, improved slightly. And that combination of a high fibre feed with the oats makes a nice continual release of energy. It's not like a sugar high and then the low. It's actually a nice sustained release of energy, and it made a world of difference to my horse doing endurance compared to what I fed before, and which was more typical of the Australian feed industry at the time. And then when I changed, and the beautiful thing is that like one of my endurance, or Squiggy, because he's a poor doer, would need a lot more oats than my second horse, which was a better doer. I would only give him, say, half the amount of oats. Like, you can adjust. That's one of the negatives of getting a bag feed that is a whole lot of different things. You can't adjust any of it. Then after, if the next choices you've got, of course, is your minerals, your vitamin E, and selenium, for example, and so forth. And, salt. We must not forget salt. Yeah, so that's what I would say.
Carol, if people do need to contact you at Balanced Equine, get more information, do you also do talks?
Well, I'm doing Equitana. I actually have, there's a group called the Progressive Hoof Care Practitioners. They're based in America, PHCP. So Progressive Hoof Care Practitioners, and bless them, they've had me out to America a few times to do conferences, and I've actually done webinars for them, like on feeding horses, feeding the performance horse, breeding mares during lactation and foals. And I've also done feeding for special needs, which includes horses that tie up. And also I've done a webinar as part of the feeding horses in general. There's a focus also on insulin-resistant equine metabolic syndrome. So people are welcome to go to the Progressive Hoof Care Practitioners and look up the webinars. They're not expensive. They're in US dollars, but they're not expensive, and it's all there. So I like that idea. I used to do talks around the country, and then the pandemic hit, and I went, you know what? I think I'd like to spend more time with my horses. So anyway, to answer your question, I have my email address on my website, and that's the best way to contact me, because if you try to ring me, I'll probably be out doing what I need to do with my horses.
Yep. So we can put all those details on Horse Chat, so our regular listeners know they can just go to horsechats.com, do a search for Carol or do a search for Layton, and they'll find this chat. And at the bottom of the page for this chat, so each chat has a page, at the bottom of the page, your contact details will be on that. So I think, they can go to your website, contact you by email, but all those details will be on that page anyway, Carol. So, I'd like to say thank you for coming on. Thank you for chatting to us pre-Equitana, and I hope all goes well, and we should be able to catch up with you at Equitana. Thank you.
Oh, thank you so much for this opportunity. And I should add too, on my website, I have a whole bunch of nutrition articles where I, really try and put it all together for people, because it is a learning curve, big learning curve when you want to go into it a little bit more deeply. Many of the articles were published in magazines a while back and all the rest of it. So, thank you so much. Looking forward to Equitana, and I hope to see lots of people there.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
If you've enjoyed this chat, then please comment, rate and subscribe. If you'd like any changes or recommendations for guests, then please contact us through horsechats.com. And while you're online, have a look at the government-accredited courses at internationalhorsecollege.com. Registered Training Organisation 31352.
Remember that our comments and instructions are general in nature and do not take into consideration your individual horses or your individual ability and circumstances. If you enjoyed this podcast, then please leave your comment below.